Hi, and welcome to the Invigor Medical Podcast, where we're going to walk with you on your journey toward optimal health, performance, and well-being. My name is Natalie.
And I'm Derek.
And we're going to be your hosts on this journey. In each episode, we share insights from top professionals in physical, mental, and emotional health. With that said, let's dive into today's podcast.
Today, we're not joined by my lovely co-host, Natalie Garland, but I'm really excited for today's guest. His name is Adam Fraser. Adam Fraser is a renowned expert in peak performance and well-being with his groundbreaking concept of the third space. He has transformed lives of many by helping them bridge the gap between work and personal life. Today, he's here to share his insights and practical tips to help us thrive in our daily routines. Dr. Fraser, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Great to be here from the other side of the world.
That's right. New Zealand. How's the weather down there? It's your guys' summer right now, right?
Yeah, it is summer, and I'm looking outside. It's very beautiful.
That's great. It's very different than how it is over here in Eastern Washington. But really excited to dive into today's podcast. Obviously, this topic of being able to transition from work to home life, work-life balance, that's something that a lot of people think about on a consistent basis, right? And so just to start off, let's hear about your story. How did you get into productivity science, and what drove you to really think about this concept of the third space?
Yeah, well, it's been a real sort of winding road. My degree was biomedical science, which is a blend of psychology and physiology. Always had a dream to work with elite athletes and go into sort of Olympic sport. And, in Australia, our peak kind of venue or lab around peak performance is called the Institute of Sport in Canberra. Went there for a while, really didn't enjoy the world of sport that much. And then got a scholarship to do a PhD. So I went back to university, completed that PhD. And during it, businesses asked me to come in and present on some of my research and what I was finding. And I just kind of really fell in love with the world of sport and the world of business and presenting. And it kind of went from there. So I started a consultancy. I started presenting at conferences. And so I continue doing research and partner with different universities around the world, but sort of disseminate that information through keynotes and workshops as well as books. And we do large-scale interventions as well. So that's kind of me and my background.
That's great. And so, that's a big transition to go from, optimizing elite sports to business. What would you say are some of the carryovers that you took from optimizing athletic performance to helping people optimize their work lives?
Wow, yeah, it's a big question. It's a really interesting one too, and I think often we look at the parallels between sport and business, and there are many parallels, but we've also got to understand how different those worlds are. If you look at elite sport, and this is not an insult, they're incredibly selfish, meaning they have to focus on themselves. It has to be about them. Usually if they have a relationship, the partner's got to be very supportive. So I think the big difference with business and sport is business, you've got to focus on so many other people, and it's a longer journey. Whereas sport, they tend to have a certain window of, I have to just commit myself and do everything to maximize this possibility of me being this high performer. So I think there are a lot of parallels, but there are also a lot of differences. So many of the things you carry over is just, some of the fundamentals about psychology and physiology and how they apply. I think it was a really good background that led me into business, but I've moved away from that world of sport now.
Listening to your TED Talks, which were very good, and I encourage any of our listeners that are watching this to make sure that you watch those as well. But I remember during that you talked a little bit about the difference between, because I think you were specifically talking about tennis players and how they're very similar in a lot of ways, but there's one kind of key thing that differentiates them. Can you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I was seeing in my research is that high performers have this ability to rapidly transition from one interaction to the next. So, Jim Lewis' research within tennis was showing that the really elite players, they were very similar to the top 100 in terms of their ability in the point. They could hit the ball as hard, they were accurate, as agile as each other. But where the elite guys stood out was their ability, what they did in between the points. Their capacity to get over a mistake, their capacity to compose themselves, and most importantly, get their mindset right for the next point. So what he talked about is the elite players were better at the transition than the, a player that's ranked 100 or 200 in the world. So, and I kept seeing this, and I saw this in even soldiers. I was doing some work with soldiers, and I said, what's the hardest part about being a soldier? And they said, coming home. And I went, what do you mean? They said, well, we've been away for 6 months. We come home, we find it very hard to slot back into our family life, and we tend to argue and fight with our family for the first couple of weeks before we settle in. And then some soldiers talked about, they would actively think about that transition. So what kept coming up in my data and research was, how do we move from one thing to another? And if we can make that transition really effective, our performance is far greater in the next thing we go into.
That's great. And so this is kind of how your concept of the third space came about. Is that right?
Yeah, very much. Like,
what exactly is that?
I just kept seeing this theme.
The third space.
Yeah. And really, if we're going to define that, if you think about our day, we move between different spaces. So the first space is what we're doing now. Second space, what we're about to do. And the third space is that transitional gap. So if I think about my day, woke up, normally I would exercise, but I've got the flu at the moment, so I wouldn't do that. So first thing I did this morning was get my daughters fed, dressed, off to school. Then I had a meeting with my business manager. I'm talking to you now. As soon as I finish this, I have to have a research meeting. So if you think about our day, we move between these spaces. And what I talk about is, how do you use that transitional gap to show up at your best to get the most out of what you're about to go into?
That's really fascinating. And so, I can imagine a couple of these right off the top of my head and I think the one that most people resonate with is the transition from coming from work. And you talked about this kind of in a larger scale with the military, but really it's coming home from work, transitioning from like all of the work thoughts that are going on, whether that's kind of like a fast-paced environment or it's a slow-paced environment, but really dealing with the challenges that you deal with at work, and then having to go into more of a relational, very personal, potentially and hopefully very uplifting and calm space, but like that might not be the case for everybody. And so can you talk a little bit more about that transition in particular?
Yeah, so obviously we were looking at transitions in general, but the one that resonated with people the most, or the one that people said, I need help with this one, is how do I go from work to home? Whether that is I commute from an office, whether it's I'm working at my kitchen table nowadays with people working in a hybrid sort of way. But yeah, they talked about how much they struggled with this. And what we found is too often we take the mood and the mindset of the day home with us. And we kind of walk in the door where we're finishing our partner's sentence because they're not talking fast enough, or we're yelling at the kids because they haven't done their homework. And we kind of bring that work mindset home of things have to be fast and things have to be done quickly. And it just creates a lot of conflict. So what we started to really embed ourselves in is, how do we transition from work to home in a way where we show up in a calm space, where we're empathetic, compassionate, mindful of the other person. So yeah, that's been a big part of our research.
That's great. And so I guess a big question for this is, how do you actually do that? Like, what are some of the practical tools that you can actually use to make sure that you come home and you're not dragging these work issues with you?
Yeah, well, what we discovered in our research, regardless of whether we're going from one meeting to another, or we've just had a sales interaction and we've been rejected and we're going into the next sales situation, the concept of transitioning is quite universal. So, particularly from work to home, what we found is there's three key parts. The first part is we call reflect, and that is how do we shut down what we've just done? So in that reflect phase, too often we think about the day and we think about, oh gosh, I didn't do that, or I didn't send that email to that client, or geez, that meeting was a disaster. I have to fix that tomorrow. And our reflection tends to be really cynical or negative. So what we ask people to do is when they reflect, just to ask questions like, what did I achieve? What went well? What was good about that? And what that does is just gets them to focus on progress and evolution, but also, and particularly at the end of the day, gives them a burst of happiness. And the mindset they take home is much more optimistic. So that's the first one. How do I reflect on what I've just done? The second piece is the rest phase. And this is simply the capacity to calm your brain and be mindful. You talked about like that often our workday is really fast paced.
Yeah.
And we kind of take that mentality home with us. So rest is just, how do I calm myself? How do I be present? And if you think about the transition from work to home, some people say, well, that's Sudoku on the bus, or reading a book on the train, or listening to a podcast in my drive home. It could be exercise. It's just anything that starts to calm the brain and gets it to focus on one thing. And then the last phase is called reset. And that is where we visualize and think about, well, what do I want to achieve in this next space? So, whether it's thinking of, I'm about to transition into the home, what kind of dad do I want to be if I've got kids? What kind of partner do I want to be? If I live on my own, when I get home, what do I want to do? Maybe I want to exercise or do meditation or connect socially with someone. And then thinking about, okay, so if that's my intention, how do I have to behave to get that?
Yeah.
Like, can I go home, if my wife works as well, but if she's had a day where she's looked after the kids all day, I might come home and they're driving her crazy. Yeah. So I have to be empathetic. I have to be thinking about the fact that she's probably had a frustrating day. And what I don't want to do is walk in thinking, oh, well, I've had a really hard day and it has to be about me and you've got to support me. It's just thinking about, well, how do I get the best out of the environment I'm about to go into? And that could be sales. It could be a meeting with my team. How do I want to show up for that? So that last piece is basically, how do I need to show up for this next thing? So yeah, reflect, rest, reset is the optimal transition we can do.
That's fantastic. I really love that. And I love how practical each step is. And really they're so universal, so they could be used in, like you say, it can be used in a business setting, or it could be used in a home setting, or it could even, like, honestly, it could even be used in like a workout setting of like, okay, I just got done with this squat, like, and reflecting, okay, how did that feel? What can I do better? Using that time to recoup and get ready for the next thing. Even like in the example of the professional athletes, I think that's great.
Yeah, and actually, just to build on that, I mean, that last phase of the reset is the parallels with athletes of they tend to visualize performance. So when I go into this race, say they're a 100-meter sprinter, I want to be really alert to the gun. I want to be relaxed in my posture. I want to move smoothly. We want to do the same thing. So if I'm going into a meeting with my team, I want to be curious. I want to, rather than tell them how things are going to run, I want to hear from them. Or say my team's had a frustrating day, I want to validate them. I want to be compassionate. So yeah, I mean, it is a universal thing, whether we're about to do a set of squats and it's like, okay, in this set, here's what I really want to focus on. Or I just had a bad set. Okay, that's a bad set, but the next one, here's how I'm going to get the most. Yeah, so it is quite universal.
Yeah. I think that really where a large portion of the power of that lies is in intentionality, right?
Yes.
Because it's very much like if you're just going through your life and you're just going through the motions and you're doing anything where you're just going through the motions, obviously you've committed that to like muscle memory, more or less, right? Where you're like, okay, I know how to do this. But when you are intentional and you're able to really focus on the finer points, that's when it really, because like, our brains are very good at getting 80% of the thing done. But like, if you really want to get that last 20%, their last 5%. Like, you have to be very intentional about doing that. And if you're not intentional, then, you might be able to get by, but like in order to actually achieve excellence, you need to be able to be paying attention and actually be very specific about what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head with that. If you look at Erickson's research around mastery, and like we've taken the 10,000 hours message, and we've got a lot of that wrong.
Yeah.
He wasn't just talking about it's the amount of practice, it's the type of practice. And when we're practicing, are we being intentional? And we're thinking like, okay, here's what my focus is for this next thing I want to do. I want to focus on this element of my leadership. And if you think about those three phases, what they really do is the reflect makes us self-aware. So what am I carrying for what I've just done? Am I angry? Am I frustrated? Am I resentful about a previous interaction?
It's like a self-diagnostic.
What's that?
It's like a self-diagnostic.
Yeah, totally. It's just that check-in with ourselves. The second part is, can I be in this moment? Because so often we're future pacing, we're thinking about what we've got to do at 4:00 or what we've got to do tomorrow. And then that reset phase is exactly what you said. Here's my intention. Here's what I want to achieve. Here's what I want to focus on. So it really helps us be aware, calm, and intentional. But also, there was something else you said before about, what was it? You made a really great point before, and I was going to build on it.
So I guess another big question that I have that I kind of want to dive into this, because obviously you've made this your life's research, right?
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm really curious about is like, what is the actual science behind each one of these steps? And, obviously there is quite a bit of science around like meditation, and there's quite a bit of science about like visualization and all these things. They've ran these studies. I'm curious to hear more about what the specific science is behind each of the different steps of your third space.
Yeah, actually, I've just remembered what I was going to say.
Perfect.
And that is that so often during the day we get into autopilot. And we just kind of, as you talked about, we just, from muscle memory, we just do things over and over, or we're not even thinking about, we're so busy and consumed by tasks. So what the third space does is stops that I've just got into a routine and I'm not really thinking about performance here. I've just got to get through this meeting. In terms of the science, I mean, we kind of touched on it, that ability of, can I be self-aware? And you look at, if we talk about leadership for a moment, if you look at any piece of good research on leadership, what they talk about is self-awareness is the bedrock of good leadership. Can I be aware of what's happening? Can I articulate the emotion I have? Can I identify my thoughts? And it sounds just
very basic.
Yeah, but it's so many people can't do it. Like so many people I work with, I ask them what emotion they have, and it's kind of either good, bad, angry. Their emotional vocabulary is really, really poor. So they can't even walk away from a meeting and go, I'm mad. Oh, actually, no, I'm not. Actually, I'm hurt, or I feel judged, or I feel taken for granted. So the greater that self-awareness, just the ability to alter our behavior or respond more appropriately is far greater. I mean, in terms of the second phase, that mindfulness, that ability to be present, I mean, there's so much data and it talks about how incredibly important that is. And then the last phase about, intention, what do I want to achieve, having clarity in this meeting, here's my number one focus. Those three things are so universal, and that's the science behind them. And there's so much data that reinforces both, all three of those things.
Yeah. The thing that pops into my mind, the word, of the neurochemical is cortisol, right? of, when you're at work, you're constantly getting all these stressors that are pulling at you and are really triggering, kind of like this either fight or flight response. You might be talking to an angry customer on the phone, or you might be dealing with like not getting a sale, or, dealing with difficult people or a difficult situation. And so, really, I think that a big part of it is like how to deal with stress. So being able to utilize a system and have a framework that's pre-established that that you can fall to, and that the more you practice, the better you get at and you can use more quickly. Really a good system to be able to implement so that you can recover from these stressful bouts. Because the evidence is also clear that chronic stress is terrible for you. Mm-hmm. And so to be able to check that wherever you can to ensure that the stress doesn't become chronic, it's an acute situation and you're able to return back to baseline as quickly as possible. I think that not enough can be said about that.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying today's podcast. I just wanted to take a quick break because if you're listening, you probably know what we do here at Invigor Medical Podcast, but maybe not what we do at invigormedical.com. So let me introduce us. At Invigor, we provide prescription strength treatments and peptides for weight loss, sexual health, and lifestyle optimization. Every treatment plan is carefully prescribed by licensed doctors and sourced from legitimate pharmacies. You don't ever need to buy questionable research chemicals again. And bonus, as a podcast listener, you get a 10% discount on your first treatment plan with code podcast10 at invigormedical.com. Now, let's get back to today's episode.
Yeah, and you've just hit so many great points in that statement of there's an element of micro recovery to it as well. Like you think about that rest phase. That rest phase might be 3 seconds, or it could be 5 minutes where I'm calming myself. And particularly if the previous interaction was a really stressful one, it's about, well, okay, I've just had a really, challenging conversation with a client who's really upset. How do I calm myself so I don't take that into the next interaction? So there is a micro recovery piece, and there's a lot of good data. Even Microsoft did some amazing research looking at people working virtually, and if they didn't have breaks between virtual meetings, how overwhelmed the brain became. But even if they had like a 4-minute break where they were practicing being calm, the brain's capacity and the brain's level of stress dropped hugely. So, I think that micro rest part, and you talked about, what'd you call it earlier before we started?
Non-sleep deep rest. Yeah. So NSDR. It's a huge thing
even
that
that
human does.
element can transform our day. So, and you also touched on a really great piece that, and this is what our data shows, is this is skill-based. Like you can get better at it, and you get better at it really quickly. And one trial we did is we got 800 business leaders, so they're all leading teams, to practice those 3 steps between work and home. Now, we measured a lot of things, but mood in the home was one of them. So how happy was their home? And what we saw is over a month, we saw a 43% improvement in mood in the home.
Wow.
Like their homes got happier by 43%. So what we learn is that we get better at this really quickly, and the impact of this is incredibly deep.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
To touch on another point of this, it seems like that these micro breaks, these micro resets, a lot of people think that growth happens in the grind, that growth happens, when you're stressed. It's like, well, you can't grow unless you're doing something really hard. But, if we look at, and specifically with exercise, but I think this is true in almost every other category as well, is this idea of like, growth happens when you're resting, not when you're being stressed. That's the stimulus that causes you to be able to grow, but where the actual growth happens is when you actually rest. And so for this reason, Andrew Huberman, one of the big recommendations he makes when after a workout, once you're done with your workout, he's like, try ending that workout with just like a 5 or 10 minute non-sleep deep rest or meditation or just laying on the ground and working on your breathing. Because he's like, if you do that, you're going from this high level of stress, and you're immediately basically inducing your body to go into a recovery state very quickly. And if you do that, you're able to essentially get to your gains, take the initial trauma or stress that you need to go through to stimulate those gains, but then you're able to go right away into the state of recovery instead of letting that stress drag out and become more chronic and something that, your body has a harder time recovering from.
Yeah, and I think, I think it was Amelia and Emily Nagoski talked about looking at stress like it's a tunnel. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what they talk about is we rarely complete that stress cycle. Like we rarely leave the tunnel. And you described it earlier as we get in this chronic state of stress. And one of the things about the third space is if we take that time to kind of reflect on what we've done, to calm ourselves, think about what we're doing next, it helps us complete that stress cycle and it helps us come out of that tunnel. And it's just such a really important concept, whether it's Huberman's advice of, well, how do I transition out of my workout? And his idea of doing that deep rest is that rest phase of the third space. Like, okay, I've reflected on my workout, what was great about it, how am I calming myself? All right, now I'm going off to my next thing. How do I prepare myself? So there's huge amounts of parallels. And I mean, what we're seeing in the data and our research is, similar patterns, similar findings that show that this ability to transition is such an important one.
I feel like listening to you talk about all this, that it's like, this seems very intuitive, right? And I was just reflecting on like, what are some of the things that could essentially like prevent these very intentional, aspects of being able to transition? What are some of the things that act as like blockers? And the first thing that popped into my mind is like phones, social media. I don't know if you have thoughts on the specific effect that, these types of technologies can have on intentional behavior and being able to transition.
Oh, man, I've got a lot of thoughts. I had a fascinating conversation with a psychologist recently, and he said to me, we're talking about phones and children and all that, and he said, think back, when you were a teenager and you got your heart broken, say like a girl broke up with you. He said, what would you do after that? And I said, actually, I can think of one where I laid on my bed and listened to Pink Floyd.
Oh, dude. And oh my gosh. You just
thought
opened
about
up a whole
the breakup and what just happened. And I said, I was just sad and I would reflect on it. And he said, that's exactly what you should have done.
Yeah.
He said, the problem with kids today is they never have time to reflect. They're never bored. They're not really exploring their internal world as much as what we did before we had technology. Because the moment I get bored, I pull this thing out,
right,
and it entertains me straight away. So I think what we're missing,
just out of curiosity, what album of Pink Floyd was it? What album?
What's that?
What album of Pink Floyd were you listening to?
Oh man, I was a huge Pink Floyd fan, even though I was a massive metalhead when I was in my teenage years. But whether it was Dark Side of the Moon, which
is a classic, obviously a classic.
Yeah, whether it's Comfortably Numb, the guitar solos.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it allows that reflection piece, and I think what we don't do today is reflect. We're not thinking about, because as soon as we come out of something, we're either looking at the phone or we're straight into the next thing. Other blockers is just the sheer pace of our lives. Like, people are so stretched now. And I think one of the other blockers to the third space is people initially go, oh, I don't have time for that. But this can be such a quick thing. What a project we worked on is we worked with O responders. So our emergency number is 000. You guys have 911.
Yeah.
So they're the people that man the phones. And oh my gosh, what an amazing group of people. And
an incredible amount of stress I have to go through.
Whenever I work with a group, I try to get deep in their world. So I would sit on and listen to calls. And I got to tell you, when you hear a human voice in true distress, it is a different sound. Like,
Yeah.
I know actors try and replicate it in a movie. They don't even get close. Like,
No, it's very
the
raw.
guttural, visceral. Like, when you hear a person that's really distressed, it freaks you out. And their challenge is they're trying to talk to these people, and they've got to be so focused that they hear the details, they calm the person. If they make a mistake and get a number wrong or a street wrong, it's catastrophic. So their ability to stay calm, but also, like, what was fascinating is they said to me, the hardest part of my job is I never find out what happened to that person. Like, I don't get closure on that. And it's like, it's actually illegal for them to try and find out. So, we had one call where a mum rang and said, my child's not breathing. And you can imagine how distressed she was.
Yeah.
And we, placed the call, and then the operator said to me, I will never know what will happen to that parent. And so their ability to let go of what they've just heard, but move into the next call, which is literally 5 seconds later, is so important. And we were teaching them the third space, and what they would do is use this concept, but really quickly. And, they don't have a lot of time to reflect or rest, but what they do is just bring themselves back to the present moment and think about, okay, how do I have to show up for this next call, which is focused, calm, intentional. So, I mean, you can use this incredibly rapidly in your day. It doesn't have to be a concept that you have to drag out. And a lot of executives say, I definitely use all 3 steps as I transition from work to home. But when I'm busy, I just think to myself, in that gap, how am I about to show up? And they said, that's the most valuable part. I think about, what is my impact? What sort of state am I in? Am I ready to go into that meeting, or am I really heightened, or am I in a mindset where I need to take an extra minute? So, I think the blocks are technology, our perception that it has to be long.
Yeah.
And, this is something we can do so quickly.
Well, and it sounds like, really, like, if, let's say you don't have a lot of time, you can kind of assess the situation and figure out, okay, well, if I don't have time to do all 3 of these, maybe this time would be best spent reflecting on what just happened. Maybe this time would be best spent setting my intentions for the next thing. Maybe this time would be best spent just literally taking a deep breath in and a deep breath out and moving on to the next thing, And so, I love the granular nature of this and how expansive this can be. Like, you could spend a whole hour, or you can spend as little as, 10 seconds just resetting your breath and getting your heart rate down.
And what it is an incredibly portable and flexible concept. Like you said, I might go from one meeting to another and I don't have time for all of it, but I just have time to go, okay, that was pretty full on. I'm just going to take 30 seconds to be calm. And then I walk into this next interaction. I had an executive, he said, I sat in your keynote about the third space, and he said, what I realize is when I go home, I'm often on the phone because I've got a global role. And he said, I walk in the house, I'm on the phone, my kids are trying to cuddle me, I'm pushing them away because I'm doing this call. My wife says, get off the phone and spend time with your children. I go, be quiet, it's the US. And he said, it's just a terrible interaction. He said, all I do now is I finish the phone call in the car. Like, I don't walk in the house on the phone. So I'm in the car, I finish the call, I shut it down, I calm myself, and I think, what sort of dad do I want to be when I walk through that door? And he said, it's just such a simple tweak, but it's so incredibly powerful.
Yeah. That just made me think. We had a guest on previously, Dr. Esther Sternberg, who talked about the importance of spaces and the relation that physical spaces have to our mental health. And like, I was just thinking about, like, when you're at work, there's very specific associations you have to work. And when you're in your car, there's very specific things that you have in association with your car. And when you're at home, you have very specific associations. Or like when you're in your bedroom, like, you hear it all the time, like, the bedroom should only be used for 2 things. The bed should only be used for 2 things: sleep and sex, right? And that's pretty much it. And so, and that's where sleep hygiene problems come up, is when you're watching TV in bed and your brain is associating, oh, there's stimulation here, I want to stay awake, I want to stay up. And so it's very interesting. I don't know if you've had any personal experiences with this, of being able to intentionally shift how you associate different spaces to your reactions.
Man, I can't believe that we haven't talked before this conversation, because it's like you're inside my head. I mean, some of the questions and observations you've made, like you've really done your research, because there is a physical or spatial component to this. We've been working with paramedics, and I mean, they see stuff we can't even comprehend. And what I learned about them is one of the biggest things they deal with now is how much violence they're subjected to from people they're trying to help. But we taught this concept to a group of paramedics, and rather than be really prescriptive and said, you have to use it like this, we just went, here's the concept, here's the idea. All right, in a couple of months, we want you to come back to us and go, as a group, how have you used it? Now, a group of paramedics in a rural area got together, talked about it, and they came up with a concept called get out of the green. Now, their uniform is green, and they said often we get home, and if we're a bit late, we have to run the kids to football practice or to piano, and we stay in the uniform because we don't have time to get changed. But they said what we've started to do now is we see our third space is we peel the day off. We leave our boots at the door and we peel and they said that it's almost ceremonial of, I'm no longer a paramedic and I'm taking the day off me.
Yeah.
Actually, this is a cracker one. You'll love this one. I presented this to a group of counselors, and their burnout rate for psychologists and counselors is really high. Yeah. Because they take on people's problems.
So much stress.
And this guy called me following the presentation, and he said, I sat in your presentation, and what it made me realize is when I walk in the home, all my clients come with me. Like literally my clients from the day come home. They're affecting my behavior in the home. They affect, my mood. And he said, I just went, all right, I'm no longer taking them into the house. And he has a carport. So he parks the car away from the house. There's a little section for the car. He said, I walk to the home, and halfway along there's a tree. And he said, I walk up to the tree and I take the clients off my body and I hang them on the tree. And I go, you'll be there tomorrow. You're not coming in the house. And he said, I physically remove them. He said, my neighbors think I've lost the plot. But he said, I actually take them off my body, and they're on the tree, and they'll be there for when I go back to work the next day, but they don't come into the house. So, yeah, I think your observation's such a great one of whether it's some sort of ritual, whether it's some sort of practice, but there is a spatial element to this as well.
Yeah. I think that a big part of that came from your keynote speech when you specifically talked about the guy where you got the original idea for the third space of how he built an entirely new entrance to his home. Do you want to tell that story real quick?
Well, I was invited by a CEO over to have dinner with him and his family because I was away from home, and they were wonderful people, but what I noticed about him is how calm he was in the home, how funny and present. And I just in this meal, I just went, oh, that's how I want to be when I'm at home. And when I was leaving, I asked him, how do you go from psycho businessman to super dad? Like, how do you do that? And what he talked about is that he built a new entrance. So he parks the car in the garage. He goes through this door into his bedroom. He's not allowed to talk to anyone in the home. He's off limits. He said, I go in there, I take the suit off. He said, I kind of that's my armor. I take that off. I have a shower. I wash the day off me. And then I do a little mindfulness thing to calm me. And he said, then I go greet the family. And he said, it might take me 15 minutes, but that's the most important 15 minutes of my day. And I walk out and I engage with the family. And this, as I said before, right at the start, I just saw these observations, and that was one to go, oh man, this thing's fascinating. This is important. So, for him, it was like, I don't actually walk into the house. I go straight to my room. I have that process. I have that ritual, and then I engage with people. Now, not all of us have the cash flow to build a new entrance into our home, but whether it's we do it in the car, whether it's exercise, whether it's, even people working from home now say, I actually get in the car and do a little commute where I'll drive around the block. And that's that's my third space. Or one guy I was talking to said at the end of the day, I go to a park, put a podcast in, walk around the park, and when I walk back in the house, I go, I'm dad, I'm a partner. So yeah, it's that was one of the interactions that really sparked this whole thing.
That's awesome. Some of the thoughts that I had when I heard that is it's very much like, and I think that all the guys in the audience, especially ones that like hero movies, I think they're all going to relate to this. It's kind of like when he walked into his room, it's like Superman going into his Fortress of Solitude. It's Batman going into the Batcave, Tony Stark going into his working den, and just having that space to be able to say, okay, I'm going to take my armor off. I'm allowed to just be completely unguarded and to allow myself to return, from the Batcave back to normal life and talk to Alfred and, have whatever conversation. And so I think that making those spaces and allowing yourself to say, maybe, obviously you might have the cash flow to build a door directly into your bedroom or to have a fire pole go down to a secret den or something, as cool as that would be. But, you can, just like you said, utilize your car, utilize your bedroom, whether, even if that just means going straight there or having some other special place like a park, and being able to have that association. I feel like the more you do that, the stronger that habit is, the much more easier you're going to be able to fall into that.
Yeah, and we gave a lot of masculine examples there, but I mean, obviously this is important for, all genders and, for women in particular, they talk about, I walk in that door and I'm straight into, doing tasks around the home.
Yeah.
But I'm in this like flurry of, I've got all these things to do. And, talking to women about this, the most common thing they say is, oh man, I never think about how I transition because I'm so busy and I have so much to do. And, men, if you look at men and women living together, men have got better at helping, but women still do the vast majority of tasks. Like men do not be delusional about that in any way. So, whether I spoke to a woman recently who said, I pick up my kids from childcare and it's just 3 minutes down the road. So, but she said, I realize I walk into childcare like this hurricane of, we're late, we have to get to piano practice, where are your shoes, why don't you have your bag? And she said, I just burst in like this hurricane of disaster. And she said, all I do in that 3 minutes is those 3 steps and think about, well, how do I walk in calmer? How do I walk in and be more composed? I'm just trying to think so many examples. A woman I spoke to recently gets the bus home and she said, I set up an alert in my calendar and she said, I'm on the bus looking at my phone. The alert comes up and asks me those 3 questions about my day. She said, I reflect on them. Then I've got a mindfulness app I listen to. That's my rest phase. So she said, I've already got my headphones on. I listen to the app as I'm on the bus. And as I walk from the bus stop home, I think, what kind of mum do I want to be? What kind of partner do I want to be when I walk through that door? She said, I've operationalized the third space. Like I've literally structured it. I had a woman recently say to me, well, the third space is okay for men, but I have to go home and I start my second job, where I've got to do the cooking, the cleaning. And I said, how does that make you feel? She said, I'm really frustrated by that. Like that I never get a moment to myself. And I said, well, you definitely have to have a conversation with the people you live with about mental load and sharing the load.
And that's part of intentionality of saying what hard conversations do I want to have with my partner? That's all part of it.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this and you live with someone else, like after this podcast, think about, well, how do I talk to my partner about this? How do we take this concept and go, well, how do we make it work for both of us? But if I go back to this woman who's like said, I go home and I start my second job, I don't have a third space. If I think about my home, like one of the things I'm responsible is for food. So I do all the meal prep, the planning, the shopping, the cooking. So every day when I come home, my job is to cook the dinner. So I could walk into the house going, far out, I've had a stressful day and I'm tired and why do I have to cook for these people? Or I can walk in and go, how do I make this a great experience? And what I do is get my daughters to help me. They get to choose the music. Like, so we play music while we cook dinner. So much Taylor Swift. Oh my gosh, I'm so over it. But we kind of like be silly and dance around and play music, and they'll choose, like, my eldest daughter's into Arctic Monkeys at the moment. So she's
fun.
like, Dad, like, I love this riff, or I love this, bridge. So it's playful while we're cooking dinner. And I use the third space to go, how do I be that guy, rather than how do I go home and resent the fact that I have to cook for people. So, regardless of your dynamic, it's about how do I show up better? Even, I spoke to a woman recently who said, I get home, I say hi to the family, I sit on the back deck, I have a glass of wine, I talk to a friend on the phone, I debrief my day, and then I come in and I'm, that's my third space.
Yeah.
So, it is very portable.
That's great. I have a lot of diverging thoughts, and hopefully I can remember all of these. But one of the big questions I have is, obviously we're talking about how this applies on a day-to-day basis, or on an hour-by-hour basis even. But I feel like this type of framework could even work on a much larger scale, of like on a week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-year basis. If you think about your three elements of reflect, rest, and setting your intentions,
reset.
Yeah, it's very much like when you go, I've heard of people and couples that like go on specific vacations where they would say, what we want to set goals as a couple, and we want to make sure that we are able to be very intentional about how we're going to do things. And they have this specific retreat where they're resting from normal life, where they can spend a couple of days mulling things over, and they can reflect on what's worked for us in the past and what hasn't, and what do we want to do moving forward. Has your work with the third space, have you dived into that at all?
I really haven't. I mean, it's such a great point. And I have heard just over the years, I mean, the greatest thing about my job is I get to meet so many people, and I get to meet wise people. And I met this couple recently who talked about that they do that. Like, they will have a little mini break where they talk about how we're going as a couple, how we're going as a family, are the kids on track? And they will actually plan out. And one of them said, we have a monthly meeting to kind of go, how are we doing? What sort of score would we give ourselves? So, it can be this huge macro thing, or it could be, as you said earlier, that hour-to-hour transition. But I think it just has so many applications.
That's awesome. My other big question, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but I guess specifically for people that are at home each day where the transitions are not so obvious, where, the lines are kind of blurred, how can people get better at being able to detect where those transitions are happening and how to better address them?
Are you talking about people working from home?
So either people that are working from home, or, you have like stay-at-home moms, or you have, other people, stay-at-home dads. Yeah, exactly. Stay-at-home parents, people that are working from home, or, in whatever life situation they end up at, but they're in one place for the entire day, but they may be shifting from activity to activity.
I think it just comes back to that intentionality of, okay, I'm moving into this thing now, or I'm moving into that thing now. If they're working from home and they're doing a lot of virtual meetings, I would get them to think about, well, how do I use that very quick transition? Do I get away from my workstation? Even from a musculoskeletal perspective, do I get away and move? Do I assume a different posture? If that meeting was very stressful, how do I transition into the next one? Whether it's different tasks, different interactions, I think it's much more about, well, say, I'm a stay-at-home parent, and, I might have a series of tasks I need to do. For some of them, we can get into autopilot, but then thinking about, well, if I'm going to catch up with someone socially, how do I transition? If I'm picking up children, if I'm about to interact with my partner, what am I doing? Or even looking at the day going, have I taken 5 minutes to be calm, to do something for myself. I think the key thing is for people listening to this to walk away with the principle and go, well, how do I need to apply this? I mean, for me, probably the biggest thing when I'm in the office with my staff, I just constantly ask myself that question: how am I about to show up? How am I going to affect them? What is the mood I bring to this meeting? Am I doom and gloom? Am I being optimistic? I think it's that self-awareness to look at our day going, yeah, that's a transition I struggle with. How do I do it more? Even I was talking to a law firm recently, and what they were talking about is when they go into brainstorming, they said, people are really negative and tend to look at the downside of it or why we can't do that. And I said, well, what have they done before? Well, they're contract lawyers, so they're looking at contracts for what could go wrong. And I'm like, well, think about that mindset. That mindset is scarcity. How do we not get in trouble here? What could go wrong? They're going to drag that mindset into this like innovation brainstorming meeting. So I said, you've got to do something to help them transition. And it sounds weird, but we got them to do a couple of improv exercises. So people that do comedy improv have a series of exercises to get their mind into this creative state. We got the lawyers to do it, and it totally changed what they brought to that meeting. They were more optimistic. They were thinking about possibility. They were thinking broader rather than, oh man, we have to be careful and we shouldn't try this because we could get in trouble for this.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The scene that just popped into my mind. Have you watched The Office? Obviously, there's the UK version and then there's the US version.
I actually haven't.
Oh, you haven't? There's a scene where Michael Scott in the US version, he goes to improv class and all he does is like he's got a captive audience and he's like bang, bang, and he just starts shooting people. He's like, Michael, you can't just shoot people. Like, anyways, kind of funny. But you know, I really like that point of being able to like saying, okay, analyzing the type of work you're doing and saying, okay, do I need to be able to loosen up? Do I need to shift my state of mind to another type of thing? But I think also that there's something to be said about like analyzing, you know, both reflecting and setting intentions of taking a very honest approach to your situation of saying, okay, well, maybe this is a very difficult situation. And, you know, something that I've learned both through personal experience and through examples of a lot of the leaders that are around me that I admire a lot is that a lot of the people that I admire know how to deal with ambiguity, that you know, they go through this process of saying, okay, well, maybe I don't know the answer, but they have enough confidence that they'll be able to figure it out when it comes. And I think that a big part of that is being able to say, well, I know I've reflected on my past. I know I've been able to do this before. So I can rest now and I can think about the problem and I can set my intention that I am confident that I can figure this out moving forward. I don't know if you have any thoughts specifically about ambiguity and dealing with things that are out in the unknown.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. That uncertainty is something we have to deal with constantly.
Yeah.
And it's something we struggle with so much. So I think even that self-awareness around, I don't have the answers here. And even admitting that in meetings, like, am I showing up authentically going, hey, we've got this problem. I don't have all the answers. I need your help. Or the reason I'm so stressed about this is that I feel I should be in control, but I don't feel in control. So I think dealing with the fact that things are so uncertain today is a really important piece. We haven't looked at it specifically, but I think it's just using those universals, that self-awareness that, okay, I feel out of control. Can I be calm? Or what sort of approach do I need to have to this? This thought popped into my head. I was working with a banking team within Australia, one of their big banks, and they were talking about how when they meet their leader, their meeting is after he's had his meeting with his leader, and he often gets told this isn't good enough. And they said, oh man, he walks into that meeting every week and he's in the worst mood and he kind of takes it out on us. And one of them was talking about how they could help him transition. And one week, one of the teams told him a dad joke. and they said he just laughed so hard, and it totally reset him. And what they started to do is every week they'd start the meeting with who's got the best dad joke. And they got one week they forgot to do it, and John, the leader, went, wait on, where's my dad joke? And it was just this ability to help him transition into a more effective state. It was just one of my favorite examples.
Were they all dads? Or were some of them not dads?
They were, it was a mixed team. There was single people, both men, women. Yeah, they were quite a diverse team, but they would just talk like everyone can relate to a dad joke.
Yeah, and they tell the joke.
And
you know what it's called.
It was just kind of like, what is the corniest joke we can come up with? And they would take turns, and they had to do, research it before they went in. But it was just such a brilliant example.
Do you know what it's called when someone that's not a dad tells a dad joke?
Oh, no.
It's called a faux pas.
Oh, my gosh.
Anyways, I do think that there is amazing power in laughter. I think you've talked about music, being able to use those to really shift and really guide our intentions. So I've really enjoyed this conversation.
You've asked such great questions.
And I think that there's such amazing content here for our listeners to listen to and to really absorb and engage with. I wanted to share, when I was listening to all your keynotes talks, there was a famous quote from Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, one of my favorite books of all time. And I wanted to share it with you and kind of get your final reaction to this. And maybe we could wrap the podcast up with this. But the quote is, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. What are your thoughts on that?
Greatest quotes ever. Yeah, I think it illustrates the third space perfectly, with much more elegance and simplicity than I have on this podcast. So I think we've ended on a high. Look, actually, I will say one more thing.
Yeah.
Having spoken to so many people about this, I get to work with really wise people. And I was working for a major investment bank in the US. And these are their global leaders. And they saw me present this. And at the dinner afterwards, they'd had a couple of glasses of wine, so they let their guard down a little bit. But so many of them came up and said, I wish I'd seen that 20 years ago. And they said, I'm sitting in your talk, and what I realize is I'm proud of my success, but the people that meant the most to me got the worst version of me. And work would get the best version, and I'd walk through that door, and the people that I loved the most just got what was left over. And they said, if I had my time over again, I just wish I'd shown up better for those people, because I just didn't. And that's what this concept's about. Whether you live on your own, and it's people in your personal life, whether you have a partner, whether you have, kids, it's about, how do I use that gap to show up for these people that mean so much to me?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Well, Dr. Fraser, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think that has been a wonderful conversation. I think there's been a lot of amazing points that have been made. If people want to learn more, where can they find out more about you and your work?
Just at dradamfraser.com, as in Dr. Adam Fraser with an S.com, is where they can find me. All my resources and work is on that website.
That's great. And the third space, is that a book that you've written as well?
Yeah. It's a book. It's just been we rewrote it in terms of, we included chapters about, well, how do I go from work to home when I'm working at home? So we've updated it, and you can get it on Audible. You can get it on all the websites in terms of where we buy books.
Well, that's great. Well, Dr. Fraser, thank you again. We would love to have you back.
Pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks for tuning in to the Invigor Medical Podcast.
If you enjoyed today's episode, you can support us by liking and subscribing.
Your feedback matters, so feel free to share questions or future episode ideas in the comment section.
For more information about our prescription strength treatments for weight loss, ED, and overall wellness, all from qualified doctors and reputable pharmacies, visit us at invigormedical.com. And don't forget to use code PODCAST10 for a 10% discount on your first treatment plan. Until next time, stay well.